In 1975, Kenner Toys had their first taste of action figure success with 12-inch figures based on the $6 Million Man. The $6 Million Man launched on the ABC television network in 1973 with 3 feature-length movies that functioned as a series pilot. The first of these debuted in March of 1973, and in January of 1974, a regular weekly television series debuted. To say that the $6 Million Man was a success would be an understatement. And the result of that was a lot of merchandise. Among these were Kenner's line of toys, which eventually expanded to a line extension based around the $6 Million Man's sometimes girlfriend, the Bionic Woman, and it was even successful enough for the $6 Million Man's handler, Oscar Goldman, to get his own 12-inch figure. Surely one of the first middle-aged men in suit action figures. Kenner offered a robust product line in 1975, one that included Dip Dot design book sets dedicated specifically to the $6 Million Man and Bionic Woman, among the first licensed property Kenner brought to this product line. Flash forward to 1977 when Kenner would sign on to produce toys for 2 different science fiction properties. One, a low-budget space opera from 20th Century Fox and director George Lucas called Star Wars, and a second one, a television series starring a young, unknown star named Patrick Duffy. This property, The Man from Atlantis, would have likely been considered the surer bet of the 2. At this stage in the toy industry, merchandise based on a television show was considered much more lucrative and proven, as the weekly episodes functioned effectively as a regular commercial for the toy line. Movies came and went, and science fiction movies were relatively dead at the box office in the mid to late 1970s. It was not uncommon for a film to open, close, and then stores to be left with pegs filled with toys that no one wanted to buy because nobody had seen the movie. The Man from Atlantis followed the $6 Million Man formula, debuting with a series of 4 2-hour TV movies in March 1977 through June of 1977. In The Man from Atlantis, Patrick Duffy played a man with a mysterious background, no memory of his identity, and webbed hands. He was assisted by Dr. Elizabeth Merrill and given the name Mark Harris. The United States Navy enlisted Mark's help to find a missing submarine filled with military bigwigs. This leads them to Mr. Schubert, an evil scientist living in a giant underwater facility who plans to take over the world. The movie ends with Mark defeating the villain and taking the submarine as his base for further adventures. At the time he was cast, Patrick Duffy was still a young, struggling actor, with his only significant role being a Taco Bell commercial. The villain Mr. Schubert, played by Victor Buono, familiar to most pop culture audiences as King Tut in the 1960s Batman series, and in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, would return several times before making his last appearance in episode 7 of the ongoing series. The ongoing series debuted in September of 1977 with a reduced budget. Quickly, there were changes in front of and behind the camera that included lead actress Belinda J. Montgomery requesting early release from her contract and getting this after assistance from a lawyer. The writing quickly degraded, with campy scripts, nonsensical plots where Mark traveled through underwater portals to other places and times, including once when he went back in time to meet fictional characters Romeo and Juliet, and the monster effects were also pretty bad. New episodes ran regularly from September to December, but after winter 1977, the show did not release any new episodes until April of 1978, when 2 more episodes were released. By this point, the series had already been canceled. 1 episode followed in May of 1978, and the final episode was released in June 1978. By this point, Patrick Duffy had already been cast in Dallas, which would lead to him becoming a successful and popular actor of the late 1970s, 1980s, through the early 1990s, when he would star with Suzanne Summers in the TGIF family sitcom Step by Step. Later in 2016, Patrick Duffy would return to the role of Mark Harris, when he wrote a novel continuing the story of The Man from Atlantis. During the time of the series, several tie-in novels were released for The Man from Atlantis. These were adaptations of show episodes and did not include news stories. For news stories, one only had to turn to the hallmark of any sci-fi property in the 1970s, a comic book tie-in with Marvel Comics. The Man from Atlantis debuted toward the end of 1977, around the time the decision to cancel the ongoing show would have already been made. It ran for 7 issues. The final issue ended with a cliffhanger involving a jester-style character, with a letter column announcement of issue 7 being the final issue. Curiously, Archie Goodwin's sign-off states sales had been very good for the Man from Atlantis comic book, and the staff at Marvel had been enthusiastic about the creation of the book, indicating canceling the comic was the decision of the license holder. As far as Kenner's contribution, all we have to go on are the items shown in their Toy Fair catalog for 1977, which showed a Dip Dot design book and paint set, as well as a movie viewer, their own version of the Viewmaster. Behind the scenes, Kenner was developing a 3 3/4 line that would be heavily vehicle-based and would have included the headquarters sub from the show. There were also prototypes shown for a 12-inch action figure of Mark Harris that was a modified $6 million man figure. For more information on the toy line that was to be, I strongly recommend checking out the write-up over at Plaid Stallions. Plaid Stallions even includes the 1978 attempt by Kenner to rebrand and rework the canceled toy line as Scuba Squad. But since no Scuba Squad toys ever hit toy shelves, it would suggest that retailer interest at the height of Star Wars fever was tepid enough to finally put the proposed toy line out to sea. For many years, it was believed by most people that none of Kenner's proposed products for The Man from Atlantis were released at retail and existed purely as a what if and never to be. This would include a proposed Dip Dot set, advertised alongside Star Wars, the $6 Million Man, and the Bionic Woman. As someone who collects the Kenner Dip Dot sets, I have alerts set up on eBay telling me anytime a Kenner Dip Dot set is listed. Earlier this year, I got an alert from eBay. And imagine my surprise when the Man from Atlantis Dip Dot set was listed. My first thought was, either this was a prototype that went out the door when Hasbro threw out all of the things that didn't interest them in 2000, when they closed Kenner Cincinnati offices once and for all. Quite a few items ended up in collectors' hands that were prototypes or dealer samples at this point. It was also possible the set in this listing was just a packaging mock-up or sample sent to someone at Kenner for approval, and the included Dip Dot design book inside might not be for the Man from Atlantis at all, and instead could be Star Wars or the $6 Million Man or the Bionic Woman, or any of the earlier books that Kenner released in the Dip Dots line, it might have had sitting around to use for packaging tests. It's also possible it was a dealer sample, and a dealer sample could have the same issues of the included design book being a far more easily obtainable book from the 1970s, or it could have just been blank paper put inside to give it the right weight. And it was a mint and sealed box item, meaning I couldn't really ask the seller to check to see what was inside. Doing that decreases the worth of the item considerably. And then, if it's the wrong thing inside, he would have a much harder time selling such a niche item to such a small group of collectors. There was also a really hefty price, so it wasn't just a simple option of buying it and hoping it worked out. The price was reasonable for a legitimate Man from Atlantis Dip Dot book, based on the rarity of such an item. So, before I was going to spend this money, I needed to do some investigation. Luckily, there are resources for such things. I first checked with a few sources I know at Hasbro to see if there was any potential this was an item that had disappeared but shouldn't have. It's really important with very rare items to make sure it's not a stolen item. Hasbro does have vaults, and those do have some really rare Kenner items in it. Most of that is Star Wars related, but still, it was possible this was something in the Hasbro vault that could have wandered off. However, that didn't seem to be the case. There was no indication this was an item stolen from the Hasbro vault. Next, I checked in with the Plaid Stallions Facebook, sending a message to see if it was in fact an unreleased item. The webpage hadn't been updated in a few years, so it's possible that there was newer information. My message was answered pretty quickly, I assume by the one and only Brick Mantooth, and he did very kindly confirm that his research had determined that some dip-dot sets did go out in small numbers for Man from Atlantis. My next stop was the KennerCollector.com. They have several PDF copies of the inventory of the Kenner Museum in 2000 when it was closed by Hasbro, and the stuff Hasbro didn't want was thrown away. All items in the museum was actually commercially released. Not everything was released in huge quantities, but if it was in the museum, it was a retail release. And there, just a few lines under the Star Wars Dip-Dot set was the Man from Atlantis Dip-Dot set. And the Kenner Museum had 12 of these sets when it was closed down. Now, I knew that there were at least 12 mint in box, never opened Man from Atlantis Dip-Dot sets circa 2000. My honest guess is if those 12 ended up with private collectors, they were either still mint in box, or they'd been opened to verify the content, but would still be in pristine mint, uncolored condition inside. So this meant if this was something from the Kenner Museum that had been thrown out and ended up in private collections, this very well could be a legit item. So this was a very productive bit of investigation, and it made it way more likely the eBay listing was in fact going to have the right design book inside of it. So I went back to the pictures from the eBay listing, and then I realized that there's a bright orange-red price tag on one of the sides of the box. So I zoomed in and it said Evans and had the price of $2.27, which is about what Dip-Dot design books went for back in 1977. So it seemed like a no-brainer that Evans was a store. I've never heard of it up until now, and I wasn't sure what kind of store it was. Was it a resale store? Was it a vintage toy store? Maybe it was a flea market of some sort, which is where something that went out in the garbage and into a private collection might end up. It created the possibility this could be one of the 12 museum sets. So I did what everyone does in this situation. I Googled it. And lo and behold, I discovered Evans. Uniquely Evans. Located in Wisconsin. Their website was pretty informative, and they aren't a resale store or a vintage toy store. They're a department store. The kind that used to be ubiquitous before Walmart, Target, and Amazon crowded out all the independent mom-and-pop retailers. An independent store that had been in business since 1936. And currently they have a ton of Lego and puzzles. Kenner Dip-Dots would have been right at home with all of these creative style toys in the 1970s. I went a little bit further and looked them up on Facebook and scrolled through until I found a picture that gave me a really good look at their price tag. It was nearly a perfect match. The Man from Atlantis set would have hit in 1977 around the same time Kenner was rushing out those first Star Wars Dip-Dot sets. So it's likely there are a few cosmetic differences in the logo on the price tag. Companies do update that over almost 50 years, but it looked almost identical. So I reached out via Facebook Messenger with a picture of the price tag and got a response that it definitely looked like one of theirs. Big shout out to Evans for being so helpful when I was trying to sort this out, and if you're anywhere near, go check them out. They appear to have a very amazing selection, and it's really important, especially in this day and age, to support local mom and pop stores. At this stage, I was pretty confident I was dealing with an item that had been sold at retail in 1978 in the Midwest. Meaning that if the design book inside the box wasn't Man from Atlantis, well, that meant that somebody at the Kenner factory messed up almost 50 years ago. So I went back and forth for a few days and then decided that this was a super rare item. And while it was more expensive than my normal budget would allow, it was my chance to own something truly unique for my Dip-Dot collection. So I went ahead and spent a little bit more than I would normally spend, but honestly it was worth it. This is kind of a holy grail item for my Kenner Coloring Corner collection, and one that most collectors weren't even sure existed based on how limited the distribution of these were back in the day. I did open it. I had to make sure it was in fact the right thing inside. So yeah, I kind of depreciated my investment in that respect. But honestly, it wasn't about the investment of it. It was about having a grow item. And I'm going to scan the pages of the book and make coloring pages from those scans. And now I'm going to put on some music so you can enjoy this vintage Kenner art from the Man from Atlantis dip dot set, followed by me coloring a page I made from a scan from the book.